Then the dragon became furious with the woman and went off to make war on the rest of her offspring, on those who keep the commandments of God and hold to the testimony of Jesus. Revelation 12:17.
Welcome, everyone. You are listening to A Word Fitly Spoken. I'm Willie Grills here with Zelwyn, Heidi, and David Apple to continue our discussion on the book of Revelation. Gentlemen, how are you? David?
Doing great, Willie. Good to be back with you guys. Everything's going well here in Paducah.
Zelwyn?
I'm doing great. The weather's getting cold, which makes me excited, and things are looking quite nice, actually. I'm just enjoying it out here in the prairies.
David, how's the weather in Paducah?
It's getting cold, man. I can barely take it. The high today was 60, I think. 60 and sunny. On Sunday, I had a member bring me what was left of her jalapeno plants. So I got a whole bunch of jalapenos. Are you guys still getting anything from your garden? Any late produce?
There's some jalapenos hanging out on the vines there. The gourds are hardy. The gourd vines have not even died down yet. We're waiting on that frost. So,
considering I had to scrape my window on Sunday morning, I'm gonna say no.
Yeah. So we're gearing up for autumn. It's still it's here, I suppose, but the leaves are still all on the trees. Everything's still green, but it's about to change. Everything's about to change. I can feel it.
And then, Zelwyn, so for the folks at home that don't know, when we record, we can actually see each other at a great distance. We believe it to be witchery, but we can see each other on camera. We don't record video, but Zelwyn is in a cozy office surrounded by wood paneling. And let me set the stage. It's wood paneling. He's wearing only buckskin. He has his microphone. There is a phone jack inexplicably high on the wall, perhaps for a legacy kitchen phone, and he has 47 foot of Ethernet cable for reasons I don't entirely understand. I don't know how this man lives, but this is how he does it.
I feel like this is doxing somehow. I'm not really sure how, but
we don't understand it. But he keeps telling us that he must live a certain way, is just the way.
This is the way it is. But it keeps the cold out wherever he is.
It's true.
Well, gentlemen, speaking of keeping the cold out, we are back talking about Revelation. We are getting into the fiery chapters here. We're coming up in chapters 12 and 13, which is everyone's favorite. So, David, why don't you kick off the discussion for us, kind of tell us where we're at here in the book.
Yeah, it definitely is everybody's favorite part, and for good reason. I mean, when we were talking just a minute before we started recording, we were saying this is where the fun really gets started. But I think it's helpful to remember its place within the book so that you're not just, zeroing in on the three numerals, 666 or something like that. Chapter 12 and 13 are the vision of the dragon and the woman and the child, and then we're going to maybe get to the two beasts here today too, hopefully. But this comes as sort of I think that it's all connected to the scroll that began to be opened or unsealed back in when did that start? Chapter 6 of the book, I think. So you have the vision into heaven where Jesus takes his place at the right hand of the Father. He unseals the scroll. John eats the scroll, and of course there's all kinds of plagues that happen in between those two things. And then the way that I think that it should be read here, you guys can certainly chime in or contradict me if you want, but I think what he's seeing, this is the content of the scroll that he ate. And so now, in a sense, he's spitting it back out for us so that we can see what was on that scroll too.
Well, especially because this section comes in the kind of the big interlude between the trumpets and then the final sevens, which will come later. And so we're seeing an image of what is going on, kind of a general picture of the whole trouble that the saints are going through, and kind of speaking of these things in very broad terms, because now we see a picture in chapter 12 of the church, where it's coming from and where it's going. So it's kind of a revelation within revelation, which I think is why these two chapters tend to get so much attention in the popular imagination, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, I think so. You get a lot of detail, so it's, I don't want to say fantastical, but I don't know what other word. It's apocalyptic, right? You get the details about this woman who's clothed with the sun and the moon and the stars, and you get details about the dragon and how many heads it has. So, if you're an artist, this certainly attracts your attention. It attracts the imagination. You can picture the things that are being described here. I think a little bit more. Well, they're very vivid, and in a way that you can't quite picture the plagues breaking out to the same level of detail.
Willie, do you have anything to add to that, or?
No, I think that's all very good. 11 is flowing right here into 12. You have the Ark of the Covenant in the temple at the end of chapter 11. And then all of a sudden, there are these signs in the heaven. There's lightning and rumbling and peals of thunder. And then a sign appears in the heaven, and it's this woman clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, and on her head a crown of 12 stars. Do you want to tell the folks at home who this woman is?
The woman is the astrological sign Virgo. The woman, I think what's happening here, John is encapsulating, whatever word you want to use here, he's summing up kind of the whole story of Scripture, the whole story of the Old Testament. I take the woman here to be, she is faithful Israel, if you want to put it that way. She is the nation, the people of God, she's pregnant with the Christ child. And so in a sense, Israel has always been the carrier, the bearer of Christ into the world. And so she, represents Israel. And then, of course, I think as we read on, that is concentrated in the Virgin Mary, who is the one who actually gives birth to Christ, not as the nation, but as the one particular woman.
So do you believe that Joseph's dream in Genesis, 37, do you believe that he is dreaming of the Blessed Virgin Mary or something else here?
No, I think the connection with Joseph is that Joseph's dreaming about himself, and he's dreaming about his brothers coming and bowing down to him, but he sees in his dreams in a similar way what John sees. So Joseph sees his brothers, the sons of Israel, bowing down to him. And he sees the sun and the moon bow down, his mother and father. And so Israel, the people of Israel, are there dreamt of in these astrological terms. And so John sees much the same thing. He sees Israel, but she doesn't look like a bunch of different people. She looks like a woman clothed in these cosmic clothing.
Right. So she is very pregnant. Birth is imminent. She already is having the birth pains. She's in the agony. Another sign appears in the heaven, and who shows up?
The devil.
The end.
Yeah.
Yes. The opposer, right? And so this goes all the way back. Again, John, and this is what's great about Revelation, is it's kind of a test. How well do you know the Old Testament, right? Can you see how many passages can your mind pile together? So Genesis 3:15 certainly comes to mind. You've got the seed of the woman and the seed of the serpent, who are at enmity with one another. And
and this is actually important because it'll be Advent before we know it, and then Christmas following that. So it's the season where you're going to see a lot of the great theologians at places like History.com and Cracked.com and elsewhere. And they're going to go, the Bible, Genesis doesn't say that the serpent is the devil. The Bible doesn't say that. It's like, well, Revelation explicitly identifies the serpent. If you just read on, thou unbeliever.
Yeah. Read to the end of the book. Maybe you'll learn something.
And somewhere there is some smart aleck Lutheran saying that. Some newly retired, closet lib is out there going, well, actually, it never says it's the devil. and then he goes off to
this is anti-legomena. So are we gonna?
That's right. Which means we don't have to listen to it, right?
Right.
Remember, guys, old libs don't want you to believe the Bible, and sometimes they wear a confessional crown. It's a very strange thing. So listen to what the men say, not what the people say about them.
It's not just old libs; it's new libs too. But that's
well,
neither
I mean,
here nor there.
old lib in spirit. That's what I'm saying here.
Gotcha.
Yeah, like a spiritual malady. But you're correct. Age wise, yeah, it's not just old. I'm talking like a Simonexer here, right? Yeah. There are new ones too. All these people who want to seek new and novel things, whether they identify themselves as confessional or not, they're always going to want to cast doubt on this. And it's funny how they always want to cast doubt on things like here, that will actually affect faith, like creation or the devil or, salvation, the necessity of preaching Christ. Yeah. Hell.
Right.
Yeah. Everybody's now we're going to get spammed with capon quotes. So
it's almost as if there's some spiritual drive behind all of it. I can't quite put my finger on it.
Almost as if there's some kind of principality, if you will, Zelwyn, who is
sort of
pulling the levers here.
I really want to talk about his heads and horns and stuff.
Yeah, well, go on. Yeah, let's do it.
Yeah, so the appearance of the devil, or the appearance of the dragon, he's not identified as the devil yet, but the reader, the perceptive reader, knows. Yeah, so his appearance is worth pointing out. And he's red. That's the first detail. He's a great red dragon, 7 heads, 10 horns, and on top of each of his head, he has a diadem. So 7 total diadems. And, you look back in the Old Testament again. How well do you know your Old Testament, Zelwyn? Aren't you preaching through the entire Old Testament, just Lectio Continua, something like
Zelwyn
that?
Zelwyn has not fully embraced the New Testament yet. That's how serious he is about the Old Testament.
So go ahead, Zelwyn. What do you see here?
Well, the redness, I think, is calling forth the imagery we saw before, like with the red horse.
Yeah.
Or I'm thinking of Zechariah, this idea of fiery, this burning, this kind of thing. So it is one who is fiery, one who is causing this kind of trouble. But the heads, the horns, and the crowns, in this case, are a reference to the dominion which Satan has. Now, whether he has that legitimately is something we can talk about, of course, but the fact that he is one who comes having authority, and he's expressing this authority with his heads and his horns and his crowns, so that we see him being one who appears immensely powerful, right?
Yeah.
Because 7 and 10, of course, are different numbers signifying completion or greatness, the 7th and the 10th. So we see one here who has the appearance of great authority, and also one who appears to have the authority upon his head, the 7 crowns.
Which means that according to Romans 13, we have to obey him, right?
Right. Well, podcast done. We're done here. So.
Right.
Well, because I want to contrast this, though, with, say, Christ, the white rider towards the end of Revelation, who is said to have many crowns.
Yes.
Right? He's not given a specific number. He's just said to have many diadems, many crowns. And so, but for the devil here to have 7 shows that he is one who appears to have great worldly authority.
Well, and there's almost an appearance of, this is 7, right? So it's almost an appearance of godliness, if you will.
Sure, yeah.
It's this sort of there's almost a false holiness to it. Even though he's a usurper, so he's this great red dragon. He's evil, but what does he put upon himself?
Right. The appearance of authority.
Right.
Or you think back to the locusts who came forth from the pit, how they were all described as wearing crowns because they want to have the appearance of authority. Contrast that again with the saints at the beginning of the book who cast their crowns before the Lord. Right? They are showing that that authority comes from God, whereas the devil wants to keep it for himself.
Right. Let's talk about him being red. This is kind of a fun one. This is another one where they go, the Bible doesn't describe the devil as red. Once again, we're going to get to verse 9. It's going to be very clear who this is. But what do they mean by red when they describe him as red?
Well, I think what comes to mind, I think whether you have a biblical reference for this or not, but the red as a symbol of anger. Zelwyn mentioned fire before. It's a consuming. It's not a pleasant, peaceful kind of a creature, right? He's angry. The other thing that comes to mind here, and we'll see this with the beasts that come up in chapter 13. I think certainly Daniel's visions are in the background here. When Daniel sees these beasts that represent the different empires that are going to arise in his time and shortly after his time. Now, when John sees the devil, he sees him as the one who's actually, animating those worldly empires. So what was on the four creatures in Daniel's vision in Daniel chapter 7 now these are the things that the devil actually, when he appears, this is what he looks like. So the horns, the crowns, the multiple heads, this stuff is all very reminiscent of the worldly powers from Daniel's visions.
Well, especially because very often in the book of Revelation, heads are presented as representing something like kingdoms, and horns are very often representing kings. Now, they're interchangeable, of course. They kind of go back and forth. But you do have this idea of a worldly kingdom, a worldly king who is arising, and the crown being a symbol of that authority. And where else does Satan show his deception more than among the powers of the world, those who are still blinded to a spiritual reality, right?
Yeah. Yeah, this is all over the prophets too. When the prophets talk, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, when they talk about Egypt and they talk about Babylon, they'll every once in a while slip in these references to Pharaoh he is like a dragon, or sometimes it even uses the word Leviathan. Mm-hmm. And so this monstrous quality of the worldly empires is now revealed for what it really is, which is not just, Pharaoh had delusions of power, but there is a diabolical element to these things.
Yeah. Or as Paul says, I tell you what pagans sacrifice, they sacrifice to demons. That this is something which the demonic forces pushing the demonic powers of the world, those who are opposed to God, are going to continuously be showing their opposition because they are of their father, the devil.
Yeah, and this is an important thing to remember, that you cannot secularize this text. There is no honest reading that makes this purely about worldly powers, human powers, to be more specific. That there is clearly the spiritual dynamic here. Who is the real power behind the throne here, and it is going to be revealed to be the devil. Now, we're going to get to the battle between good and evil here in the next segment. But, suffice it to say that there is a real spiritual battle happening in the book of Revelation, just as there is today. And it's an important thing for us to remember that ultimately, with all the evil you see befalling your nation and your churches or something like that, remember, you're ultimately not wrestling against flesh and blood. You're in this spiritual struggle against these malevolent forces. And thankfully, Jesus Christ and his angels fight valiantly on your side. So you're going to win this one, trust me. But it might look, it's darkest just before the dawn, as we say.
Well, and I think what you're trying to say, Willie, is that there is no political solution to these things.
No long-term political solution.
Well, and the point being that we're not going to vote our way out of these,
no.
These
you're not going to vote your way out, and you're not going to spending bill your way out. You're not going to allocate the right funds or deallocate a certain number of funds and stop the evil, right? As long as my tax dollars don't go to it, that means I'm opposing evil. No, that's not going to be enough. That's not going to be sufficient. It's going to take something more, and it's going to take an act of God to strike down evil and to bring back the wayward, as it were.
Exactly.
We've got the woman, we've got the dragon. We should probably quickly mention the child who actually is born here. It's interesting to me, anyways, that there's such a brief mention of the child who is Jesus, the Christ, right? And I think John doesn't want to just skip over him, and I don't want to suggest that he's insignificant here, but this is important to remember. The purpose of the book of Revelation is not to be a fifth gospel, but it's to draw attention to what the church is going to go through, the body of Christ. So the child is born, and there is this mention that he is the one who will rule all the nations with a rod of iron. So as much as the devil has, he's got all these diadems and these horns, he doesn't have the rod of iron. And this is Christ's domain. He has all authority in heaven and on earth. And so he's mentioned here, he's born, and just as soon as he appears in the vision, he's caught up to God. And so, you don't have a full description of his ministry other than the end goal of his ministry, which is the authority over all things.
Yeah. Well, all right, guys, we're at our first break. We'll be right back with more about Revelation here on A Word Fitly Spoken. Listening to A Word Fitly Spoken. I'm Willie Grills here with Zelwyn, Heidi, and David Appold. We're talking about the book of Revelation, in particular, chapter 12. All right, well, we've identified the lady in birth. We've identified the devil. To be more explicit a little bit. We've talked about the Christ child. So, David, where are we going next?
Well, there is one thing that we haven't mentioned in that initial vision, which is what happens to the woman. So the child is snatched up into heaven. He takes his place and I think, that's the ascension of Jesus, right? He takes his place at the right hand of the Father, and that's what chapters 4 and 5 record from heaven's perspective. But then what happens to the woman? And again, you got to be a little bit, what's the right way to say this, guys? You have to have a little bit of mental flexibility here. So the woman was Israel, was Mary, and is now going to be a figure representing the church. Is that fair to make those things? Do we need to establish that?
Well, if we're saying Israel, we don't mean like ethnic Israel here. We're talking about the church who was called Israel in the Old Testament, right? So you could put it in those terms.
Yeah. And we have to be very clear on the continuity there between what was the people of God, lest we fall into the dispensationalist trap,
right?
Of there's still different peoples of God. There's one people of God united in Christ from the beginning. Sorry.
Yeah. So that was Old Testament Mary. And then now the woman runs away into the wilderness, and she finds out in the wilderness there's a place prepared for her, and she's kept safe for this period of time, 1,260 days. And we're going to get this again. John's going to come back to that after this description of what happens in heaven at the same time. But just to see the church, and you can think of, what Jesus said to his disciples, when you see these things, flee into the wilderness, right? And escape the wrath that's coming on Jerusalem. So I think that's what, if you're looking for historical markers here, I think it's good to keep what happened, what is, again, a lot here depends on your understanding of when the book of Revelation was written. But I think that what he's talking about is what is soon to happen in the city of Jerusalem.
Well, and even when you're saying she's going to the place prepared for her of God, or prepared by God, that shows, for one thing, again, God's control over the situation. She's not running away, just going out into the wilderness. What is going to happen to me? What's going to happen to me? She's going to the place that God intends her to go, because he is the one that is going, guiding all of these things. And on top of that, too, as we're going to see, especially at the end of chapter 12, she is going to a place where the dragon cannot get her. Now, that doesn't mean that the dragon isn't going to still war against her, or more specifically, her offspring, but it does show that the dragon cannot defeat the church, that the dragon is incapable of destroying that which he has sought to destroy, and she will be protected even during this period of 1,260 days. Right?
Yeah, I think so. This is, again, one of the things that comes up again and again in Revelation is the devil's plans are constantly frustrated in sort of like maybe if you were a literary critic, you would call it a deus ex machina kind of a way. It doesn't, he's going to come for the war at the end with his army, and he's just defeated, and there's no real mention of how the battle takes place. Here, he's trying to get the child. Well, the child is caught up to God, so his plans are frustrated. He tries to get the woman, and it just doesn't work out. So that again is reinforcing this point for the saints that, the victory, if you endure, the victory is guaranteed. It's for sure.
Well, very good. Willie, do you want to add to that?
No, I'm kind of waiting here till we get over into this heavenly battle a little bit more.
You want the exciting stuff. So.
Well, I mean, we're going to get into Michael, and it's going to be a tricky one because are we looking at, end times battle here? How do we work the crucifixion and resurrection and ascension into this? So we'll get into that text first before we kind of talk about this. David, do you want to take us into that?
Sure. Do you want me to read it?
Sure.
All right. So what happens immediately after this in the text anyways, and I think what you said, Willie, is a good question to keep in mind. What time period, are we going back in time? Are we going forward in time here? What's the time period? War arose in heaven, Michael and his angels fighting against the dragon. And the dragon and his angels fought back, but he was defeated, and there was no longer any place for them in heaven. And the great dragon was thrown down, that ancient serpent who is called the devil and Satan, the deceiver of the whole world. He was thrown down to the earth, and his angels were thrown down with him. And I heard a loud voice in heaven saying, "Now the salvation and the power and the kingdom of our God and the authority of his Christ has come, for the accuser of our brothers has been thrown down, who accuses them day and night before our God. And they have conquered him by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony, for they loved not their lives even unto death."
Yeah, so this is going to be an interesting one because you're going to get Satan defeated, but then eventually he'll be loosed for a minute later, right? So I think that's important. This is where I'm kind of leaning toward, if I can be that cautious in an interpretation of a book like this, but it seems to me that we do have Michael casting Satan down without talking about the beginning of time. This is a little bit different, or the beginning, when the angels first rebelled. This to me seems like something that's happening at the crucifixion, resurrection time, because you have the child caught up, so we can say the ascension too. Let's just put all that together and just, Christ at the time of Christ's victory. So you have Colossians 2, right? Having disarmed principalities and powers, he made a public spectacle of them, triumphing over them. So that's, that could be, herring of hell kind of stuff too, if you want to look at it that way. But you have also Jesus in John 12 talking about, now is the judgment of the world. Now shall the prince of this world be cast out. And so when you're trying to put it on a timeline, it's a little bit tricky, but it seems clear from scripture that you have a defeat of Satan happening, of course, at the crucifixion, resurrection, ascension, but there's still more yet to come. The question is, when is Revelation 12 happening? What do you guys think?
I think it's misleading to try to say like it happens specifically at this point, because the imagery that John is using throughout the chapter is talking about a very wide period of time. Because, like you say, you have the imagery of the Old Testament with the woman, also with the church, being in one image. So it really is this image of what is going on through this whole kind of wide time space, as opposed to one like mathematical point.
Right, but then that's what I'm saying. Then you get to Christ, and I think the reason why he's there so briefly in the text is because his earthly ministry, the time from his birth, the time from the incarnation to the ascension is a relatively short period of time in actual history. but it is also the culmination of all of this,
Right.
where a lot of this takes place.
Well, I don't think you should overlook when it says that the accuser of our brethren, this is verse 10, accuser of our brethren is cast down, which accused them before our God day and night, and they overcame him by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony.
Yeah.
So you have the blood of the Lamb, of course, which of course happens at the crucifixion, when
Right.
Jesus dies. But it's also the word of their testimony. It is the preaching of the gospel that is included in that.
That overthrows the devil. Yeah. And so we are in this age, the age of the church. The kingdom of God is at hand, which means it's conquering the kingdom of the devil.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm glad you mentioned this, because it was a point that I was about to forget to make. So Jesus lives, dies, rises again, ascends to heaven, defeating Satan, but we sometimes picture it as, like pressing a button from far away and the devil just is undone. But no, Michael is the one charged with enforcing the mandate, as it were, with carrying out the king's decrees. And here it clearly is Michael the angel, the archangel.
Right.
I would stake my claim on that one. I don't think this is a case where you can go, well, who is Michael here? Seems pretty clear. So that even Satan being cast down is done through means, including Michael, but also, like you say, including the preached word. And we forget, we talk about spiritual warfare, but we don't think about the church going out, churches being built, the word being preached as being part of that. We know that kind of instinctively, but we forget it. That Satan is cast down as the Holy Spirit works through the gospel.
Well, even in the Gospels, with the sending of the 70, when they come back, Jesus says, I saw Satan fall like lightning.
I saw Satan fall like lightning, right.
And we can't overlook that. It was in their preaching of the gospel at that moment that Satan was cast down.
Well, but you don't go with like the interpretation that Jesus goes all Abe Simpson and just starts talking about something that happened a long time ago for no reason.
I think it's a present reality, right?
Yeah, right.
Maybe one way to put it that might help kind of keep it in perspective here. The life, death, resurrection of Jesus has effects in both heaven and on earth. So the devil, if you look back in the Old Testament, you have places like Job where Satan has some kind of entrance into the heavenly council room. Okay,
Absolutely.
And so after Christ's ministry, he no longer has that same level of access. And that's, I think, what is being described here is he's booted out, he can't get back in, and therefore his accusations cannot be brought into heaven before God the Father. But he is thrown down on earth, and I didn't read this verse, but the rejoicing in heaven is also then coupled, there is a bit of a problem, right? There is woe on earth because the devil is now on earth. And so this is really where the vision is driving, is to say, all right, what happens now because of Christ's ministry? Heaven is, the devil no longer has access there, but his wrath is poured out on earth, and the saints on earth endure that wrath. And so you have to, that's really where it's going. That's the attention that's being driven at.
But before we get into that last part, talking about what's going on earth, because you're right, that is the main focus here, the thing that we really do need to center on. Is it too much to say, and you guys can push back on this, that what is happening with the preaching of the gospel, what is happening with the triumph of the Lamb, is that the kingdom is now expanding? Is that too much to say? In the sense, like, you think of Isaiah where it says, of the increase of his government there shall be no end. That there is a sense in which Christ has conquered, and there's also a sense in which he is going forth into enemy territory to conquer all of it.
Oh yeah, I think that's exactly right, Zelwyn. So the child has the rod, and it is his to rule over all nations, but that isn't the reality of what we see right now. So like Hebrews, all things are under his feet, but we don't see that. That's 1 Corinthians 15 too, right? That he is the one who has all authority in heaven and on earth, and the church, the mission of the church is to extend that authority, to bring it into effect, I don't know what exactly the right way to say that is, but to convert the nations to Christ, because that is his rightful inheritance, is all of them.
Can we to exercise dominion, if you will?
There you go.
It's funny, guys don't like that word because they associate it with 90s theonomy or something. But weak men don't like that word. Weak Christians don't like the word dominion. Dominion belongs to Christ, and Christ has a mandate to go ye into all the world making disciples. So you're conquering by any other name. Now you're not doing it by sword, but you're doing it through a sword, so to speak, the sword of the Spirit. And you are conquering, and where nations are conquered by the gospel, they flourish, and God is glorified until they, fall into the hands of the devil once again. But no, evangelism, and in the strictest sense, is an activity of dominion, and we want that. Mm-hmm. I want to convert people, and by the power of the Holy Spirit, according to God's will, He will. And where people are conquered, nations are conquered, and that's a good thing. I want Christian nations, Zelwyn and David. I don't have this, I don't have this fetishistic view of suffering. We will suffer. That is promised. But a lot of these guys think that, if life becomes worse, that it's magically going to lead to revival, and it doesn't. It does not lead to, it does not always lead to. God does sustain the faithful remnant in the midst of that. That is the promise. But you shouldn't be like just, rubbing your hands together and just gleefully waiting for the collapse of your homeland. You should pray that God shows mercy in two ways, that He brings people back to Christ, but that He also, helps them live lives where they have enough food and they're not at the mercy of roving gangs and things like that. Because when you're praying for your nation to fall, that's what you're praying for. You're praying for the devil to win for a time, whether you realize that or not. But understand that God can make Christians in good times too. Now, I believe bad times are coming. I believe Revelation teaches that. But at the same time, you guys need to slow your roll a little bit here. Prepare for the bad things that are to come, but also pray that God would show mercy temporally as well as eternally. That's a good thing. But at the same time, I'm not naive. Please, by all means, have water and some ramen noodles in stock. Do not misinterpret me here. Yeah, we have to be realistic here, but at the same time, we should not be gleeful when a nation falls into the hands of the devil, I guess is the takeaway here.
And also, to go along with that, I do want to say that evangelism is an act of war. We should say it that clearly, an act of war against the devil.
Right.
But also, when Jesus says very clearly that the gates of hell shall not prevail against the church, do realize that what he is saying there is that the gates of hell will not be able to resist the church. The gates which prevail are gates which are standing firm against the church, but the church is going out on the offense in order to bring about the dominion of Christ into all the world. But is it even too far to say then that there is a sense in which Satan is always falling because the church is going out into the world to conquer his territory?
Yeah, I think what Michael did in heaven is now what the church is doing on earth, right? We pray on earth as it is in heaven. So we want the same banishing of the devil that is accomplished and finished in heaven to also be accomplished and finished on earth, even while we recognize, you put as many caveats in here as are necessary, like that won't really be finished until Christ returns. I'm not saying anything against that, but the mission of the church is to continue that warfare, and even the means are the same, right? The blood of the Lamb, the preaching of the gospel, this is what conquered the devil in heaven, and it's what also banishes him on earth.
Yeah, and I think that is, it exists not just in the context of like a guy going out and preaching in the street corners. It's also the father preaching to his children, and it's the master teaching his slaves, right? Or the employer, the superior teaching the inferior, as it were. And so it's in every sphere Christ is preached, every sphere Christ is proclaimed, the word of God taught, and the devil is routed in every sphere. But ultimately in the main one. But, I'm just not willing to cede any ground to the enemies of the gospel.
And we're looking forward to a church which is going from victory to victory, not a church which is limping along sadly and is going to fail eventually, and we need to get it out of the way.
Or Zelwyn, a church that looks like this great red dragon that has the semblance of godliness, this great beast that has a form of godliness upon his head with all of these diadems, right? We don't want that church either.
Right.
You definitely don't want to be a part of that. That's worse than being a part of no church at all.
Having the appearance of godliness but denying its
power.
Yeah.
And I don't know if the illustration here, Zelwyn, is fog machines and big productions, or if it's brocaded chasubles and miters. I don't know.
But we'll leave that one up to you.
Right. There were 10 horns, so there's room for both.
There's room for both. Yeah, all across the spectrum. All right, guys, we're almost up to our next break. Any last words on this subject before we head to the next chapter?
Well, I think what I would just add in here is that it is good to see Revelation not to take this vision of, because what's going to go on next is that the dragon is going to persecute the children of the woman, right, or her other offspring. And so if you take that as this is describing the church of all times and all places, then you do get into this kind of a pessimistic mentality of, well, we're just always going to suffer under the persecution of the dragon, and there's nothing we can do about it other than to just hole up in the wilderness and wait for Christ to return. What we're talking about here is saying there is a time and a place for fleeing, there is a time and a place for hiding, but there's also a war. That's not always the strategy, right? There's other tactics to engage in winning the war.
Right. There's a time to gird up your loins and do stuff I can't say on a public podcast, right?
Yeah. Is this a Rod Dreher respecting podcast? Yes or no?
Is there such thing as Rod Dreher respecting?
Point taken.
We'll be right back with more Word Fitly Spoken right after this. Welcome back, everyone. You are listening to A Word Fitly Spoken. I'm Willie Grills here with Zelwyn, Heidi, and David Apple talking about Revelation chapter 12. Well, it's been a very fun one, and the Dreyer people did not call up in between recording this segment and the last, so we're okay. A lot of guys like that. We're going to talk more about that as Revelation goes on. Hunkering down, building community, but also still sending out. But for now, we've got more Revelation 12 to talk about. David, where are we going?
Yeah, well, where we're headed now. So the child was born. He took his place in heaven. The woman disappeared into the wilderness, to the place prepared for her. And then you get that interlude where the devil now comes down on earth, and he's furious, right? So in verse 13, starting at 13, I'll just read a little bit. When the dragon saw that he had been thrown down to the earth, he pursued the woman who had given birth to the male child. But the woman was given the 2 wings of the great eagle, so that she might fly from the serpent into the wilderness, to the place where she is to be nourished for a time and times and half a time. So you get this vision of the devil's attempts to destroy the church. He couldn't stop Christ. He couldn't destroy the child. So now he turns his attention to the child's mother, and he goes after her, but she's kept safe.
Yeah, and especially with the imagery of the wings of a great eagle. You have the psalm imagery, of course. The wings of an eagle lift you up on eagle's wings. That's how it goes. Your favorite hymn, Willie.
There you go.
So, But I mean, it's the imagery of speed. It's the imagery of flight, that she is going into a place where the dragon cannot follow, right? That she is going to be taken into this place and protected and nourished for a time and times and half a time, which of course corresponds to 42 and 1,260 and all those various ways of presenting it. So it's all the same time, which is basically a poetic way of talking about 3.5, half of 7. So it is a time which is not forever. It is a time just does not go on for, indefinite, like it's just going to go on until the end of time. It is a time which is defined. It is a specific period of time in which she is going to be persecuted, and yet the devil will not be able to destroy her, right?
Would you say that it's like the time when Nero persecutes the Christians? Or maybe it's like the amount of time, say, of like a famous, I don't know, Jewish-Roman war, like roughly in that kind of time frame, like 3.5 years,
Right. Well, absolutely. It's all related.
Yeah.
And of course, I would connect it to previous persecutions too, with Antiochus before the time of the New Testament. You have the Jewish-Roman war with the destruction of the city in 70. I mean, these things are all related. But I do think that they are pictures of the ongoing struggle, right? That it is something that is, the devil is constantly going to be going after the church, and that's not going to let up, but it is defined for a specific period of time.
Well, do you think that the devil is going after the church today?
I was going to say is the Pope Catholic, but then I stopped myself.
Right. Is the Pope is the Pope reptilian?
Is the Queen of England from this world?
Let's contextualize Revelation for our time. Let's go big Hal. Let's do some Hal Lindsey posting. Big Hal Lindsey hours here. How do you gentlemen see the serpent coming after the church today?
Well, I think it's much more like what happens in chapter 13 than it is like here in chapter 12. Mm-hmm. So in 13, the dragon's going to raise up some beasts, and then there's a little image, and you get the mark of the beast there at the end of 13. I think that's the kind of persecution we experience more than this. Obviously, we're not being. Maybe I shouldn't say obviously. We're not being physically martyred in the way that they were in the first century in Rome. We don't have a Nero lighting us up as human lamps for his garden parties and driving his chariot around. But we do have all these pressures, all these subtle subversions, all these ways of undermining the faithful, and oftentimes by religious leaders, right? So the Pope calls into question all kinds of things that shouldn't be called into question.
Yeah.
What if I keep some big Rushdoony hours here?
Always.
And say that we see the warfare happening like ideologically, that these encroachments upon human thought, like with Marxism, with those kinds of things influencing the way that we think, and in that way causing us to think in non-biblical ways.
Be transformed by the renewing of your mind implies that you can be deformed by having a non-renewed mind.
Right.
Yeah.
Or that you can be deformed even at, that you can lose it, that makes shipwreck of your faith.
And of course, when we get into 13, which won't be today, we're going to talk about all the fun stuff like marks and chips and everything else that everybody's wondering about. But we want you to come back for that episode. So we're not going to talk about it all here.
Yeah.
Yeah. What else? I mean, our boy John sees a talking image that deceives people. I don't know what else to say.
Well, okay. So let me go back to this. Zelwyn, you're making the point. There is this limited time where this goes on, and I think that's when you look through church history, there are times of it's not just constant persecution, right? So there are times where there is this intensity of persecution that then passes away, and the gospel is, or the church comes out of hiding or comes out of, kind of being sealed up, being protective. And then oftentimes there's a great missionary advance. So if you think of the time of the apostles, you kind of have both going on. But in Jerusalem, the initial growth of the church in Jerusalem is quickly met with this opposition by Herod. It's met with persecution, physical suffering of the apostles, and so they have to leave Jerusalem, which then opens up the mission to the Gentile world. And I think if you look through different regions and how things go, when the gospel comes into a region, there is this warfare, there's this clashing of kingdoms, and then there's often the initial success is met with some kind of persecution, but that persecution doesn't last forever. And then there is, the end of the 1,260 days, so to speak, opens up a time for missionary growth.
A time of revival, you might say.
Yeah.
I mean, let's Reformation post for a minute here. You kind of have that. It's kind of funny. We forget the kind of the peaceful period, where the Lutheran Reformation is able to spread throughout Germany and other regions. That after a certain point, like Luther's a little nervous at first, but ostensibly after Worms, he's protected by the prince, so he's able to freely publish what he wants. A lot of people don't like that take, but it is the historic fact that he's not in great danger after a while. He's pretty well protected. But you did have a period there where it was very likely he was going to lose his head. And while he is comfortably writing from Wittenberg, it's kind of like, I like the line where it's true. Melanchthon and I sat and drank Wittenberg beer. The word did everything. Well, it did, but there were also preachers going out with that word, and they were being killed. So,
right.
So depending on, put that into context. Luther, I hope, is not saying that it was just sort of going out there in some sort of ephemeral way. No, there were people going out, and in certain regions there was peace. They were able to take an assessment of the churches, see what they needed, and to teach and to train and to preach, administer the sacraments and all of that. But elsewhere they were going, they were being, bound to stakes and burned, or garroted, as it were, things like that, strangled. And so, but you see that cycle even in Reformation history, is my point, where there are times, and especially on the continent, it goes back and forth a little bit, doesn't it? With hey, we're safe to practice our religion. No, we're not. So it happens even outside of Rome and even outside of the Soviet Union, because that's how we how many Christians picture history, right? The early church, which was persecuted by the Romans in their mind. They're not allowed to talk about the Jewish persecution, but the Romans, and then everything was cool. Maybe there was some popish persecution. They don't really talk about that. And then, the USSR or something like that. But, all throughout history, there's been this cycle of suffering, but it led to victory and led to a time where the church was able to expand in peace. Then, of course, the peace would eventually end too.
Right.
Right.
So when Luther says, and I do want to make that point very clear, when Luther says the word did everything, of course he understands the great cost that the great danger that certain preachers were put into, and the great cost of that people gave up in order to spread that gospel. And so when you say that word, when you say that phrase, please do not mean it like many people do today. And it's like, well, I just sat and drank and people became Christians.
Somehow, some way. Right.
Somehow, some way. Yeah. It's a call to trust the word to do it, but you still have to trust the means that the word prescribes, namely preachers, pastors, teachers.
The witness needs a martyr. Yeah.
Right.
Because the dragon is not overthrown by the blood of the lamb and the Christians drinking beer. The dragon's overthrown by the word of their testimony. The word must be preached.
The celebratory drinking does come in the eschaton at that great high feast.
There you go.
Right.
With fatty meat and wine on the lees, things like that. So
be good stuff.
Yeah. If you're not a wine drinker, you're not going to enjoy heaven. Sorry, independent fundamentalist Baptists.
If you're not a wine drinker, you will be.
We just lost half our audience.
We just lost half our audience. Yeah. Guys, come back. Please reknot your ties and come back to the podcast.
So here's a question that you guys can help me with. At the end of chapter 12 here, you've got the woman is kept safe, and if we take her as a figure of the church, The church is kept safe, but then there's these other people that the devil goes afterwards. So how do you understand this? Who is the woman here? Is she a picture of the totality of the church, or is she just, a certain geographic part of the church? Does this question make sense?
Mm-hmm.
She flees into the wilderness. She's protected, and it's very Exodus. It sounds like the Exodus, because that's where the eagle's wings come in. The devil spews out all this water, and instead of getting the woman, the water is drunk up by the land, and she's protected. But then he goes off to make war on the rest of her offspring. So apparently she's been very busy and has multiple offspring in other places. What do we make of that?
Well, it's the same image. I mean, we have the woman being the church, that she is an image of, I guess you could say, the totality, but she has many children, that she has, those who actually keep the commandments, those who believe in Jesus. So it's kind of a both and image. And I mean, even Jesus is called, our brother, for example, or the firstborn among many brethren. So you do have this imagery of the church, not only as a body, but also as brothers, as multiple individuals, I guess you could say, if you don't stretch the language too far. And to recognize that, the church is safe against the attacks of Satan. She cannot be overthrown, but that doesn't preclude individual Christians being assaulted by the devil. In fact, that's where he's going to concentrate his attack.
Yeah, so it's almost like there are attacks that the devil makes on certain geographic parts of the church that don't affect the whole rest of the church, right? I think this is one of the places where, in one of our previous shows on Revelation, we talked about these different, the four kinds of interpretations of Revelation. This is where, again, part of the interpretive power of the preterist view is you have this intense focus on what's happening in Jerusalem, but that also helps the non-Jerusalem church understand what's coming to her. So if you take the woman as Jerusalem, the Jerusalem Christians, they flee the city of Jerusalem. But now the devil, at the end of chapter 12, he's going out, and what kind of warfare is he going to carry out on the other congregations?
And you're right. There are localized attacks that are different, and it depends on where you're at, right? Certain parts of the world are in bondage to the devil in a way that others are not. It's kind of like with sin. We all the time say all sin is sin, and no, it isn't. There are degrees of sinfulness and rankings of sins in the Bible. Confessions teach this as well. And so there are different degrees of hardening, for example, and different degrees of darkness, so that and the Lord in his providence brings the gospel to them in his own time. I mean, you have a big chunk of what they now call the global south that was left in heathen darkness a lot longer than Europe was. Europe is Christianized first, and then they eventually send missionaries down, for example. So for a time, the devil is given a greater sway over places, so that you can say that, I mean, it's just a fact, right? I mean, outside of North Africa, which is, the gospel is there, but you look at like sub-Saharan, right? Or the Inca tribes or whatever. It takes a little while for the gospel to get to them. But the gospel reaches the British Isles pretty early in the history of the church. Right. And so this is part of the hand of providence when we're talking about the gospel spreading. But the devil also seems to tailor his persecutions, right? And it tailors his temptations even. So that in a more primitive society, he's still doing old school paganism, like you might find, where you might find explicit human sacrifice, not our implicit human sacrifice to comfort and things like that. Where we have abortion and where we have aborted fetal cells for the sake of, better candy coatings on ibuprofen or something like that. In certain parts of the world, you still have, and you did have up until very recent history, explicit sacrifice to false gods, for example. There are still, albinos being kidnapped in some country somewhere for their magic properties, that sort of thing.
But Willie, the British stopped the practice of sati in India, and that was bad.
That was bad. They were, Yeah, right. Imagine believing that. Somebody actually does. I remember, I'm going to tell this story, being in a class at an institution I won't name with a guest speaker I won't name, but I probably should, but I can't remember his name, to be honest with you. Such was the impression this guru made on me. And he was like, well, you can't judge a culture because they're all the same. You as a Christian can't go in and judge because who are you to judge? I'm like, no, this is bad. Like, child slavery, sexual slavery is bad. Okay? Mutilation of their bodies, objectively bad. Well, what does that mean? Are you making a value judgment? Yes, I am making a value judgment. 100%. Because God does this everywhere. And he calls the Hebrews, make a value judgment on the Canaanites. I'm doing it. And you're carrying that out. So, where the church goes in and civilizes, we can't make any apologies for that. Maybe when you die, you don't set your wife on fire. Maybe.
Maybe.
Maybe all of these things that I blush at even using some of these horrible examples like I just did earlier of what evil men do to people, but the church comes in and goes, enough of that. Here's the light of Christ. You no longer need to do that. And we're actually taught to apologize for that. I'm not even apologizing for teaching them how to sing and for putting Western clothes on them.
Imagine thinking Cortez did anything wrong.
I mean, it's just so bizarre to me how, if you look at how these people were living, you honestly think that it was bad? And they go, well, atrocities were done. Sure, atrocities were done by conquerors in every place. Wait till you see what the Indian tribes in America did to other tribes that they conquered. But where Christians did go into the world, it's been largely very good. Not just spiritually, but things like potable water and wells and things like.
Well, this goes back to what Zelwyn was talking about before with the mission of the church is not just to. Well, the mission proper of the church is to preach the gospel, right? But the shepherding of the nations and that's synonymous with ruling. He rules with his rod of iron. He does teach his law, and that brings about all kinds of temporal blessings as well as the eternal blessing of the gospel.
Well, I'll remind you of what our brother James says: pure religion undefiled before God and the Father is this, to visit the fatherless and widows in their affliction, and to keep himself unspotted from the world. And so the church goes through with a civilizing influence in order to take care of these things. Wherever the church goes, there the gospel is preached. Wherever the gospel takes root, there the Holy Spirit is at work, and then there is true Christian charity, and often an improvement of community, especially the church community at first. The devil, I don't know. Maybe the devil builds hospitals, and he does, and that's probably why I don't like to go to them today if I can avoid it. So
we build them, and he corrupts them.
Yeah, we build them, and there we go. All right, guys. Any final words? If we've got any listeners left.
Well, the end of chapter 12, we'll set this up because I'm sure that people take copious notes as we go through this. The end of chapter 12 is just, it's just about to launch into the really good stuff. So at the very end, the dragon ends up, he can't get to the woman in the wilderness, so he goes to the seashore, and he stands on the sand on the seashore, and something's going to come up out of the sea. And so that's where we're headed. We're headed to, all right, he couldn't get to Jerusalem. He couldn't get to the quote-unquote Jewish Christians. But what's he going to do to us poor Gentiles now?
Very well. Well, Zelwyn, David, thank you very much. This has been A Word Fitly Spoken. If you like what you heard and want to know more, check us out, wordfitlyspoken.org, facebook.com/wordfitly, or even Twitter, @wordfitly. I'm Willie Grills here with Zelwyn, Heidi, and David Appold. God love you, and God bless.
She gave birth to a male child, one who is to rule all the nations with a rod of iron. But her child was caught up to God and to his throne. And the woman fled into the wilderness, where she has a place prepared by God, in which she is to be nourished for 1,260 days. Revelation 12:5 and 6.